Chapter 1: Patrolling the Atlantic. The year was 1986. The Cold War was entering its twilight, but no one could have known it yet. Tensions between East and West were still razor-sharp. Just months earlier, the world had watched in horror as Chernobyl melted down, exposing the fragility of Soviet nuclear technology. Trust between Moscow and Washington was scarce, paranoia was abundant, and the oceans remained the front lines of the nuclear standoff. Far below the waves of the Atlantic, hundreds of miles east of Bermuda, a Soviet submarine prowled silently. Its name was K-219, a massive Yankee-class ballistic missile submarine of the Soviet Navy's Northern Fleet. At over 120 meters long, armed with 16 nuclear-tipped missiles, it was a floating city of steel, and one of the Kremlin's most powerful weapons. The mission of K-219 was clear: patrol the ocean undetected, ready to unleash Armageddon if the order ever came from Moscow. For the men on board, life was both routine and suffocating. The crew of more than 100 sailors lived for weeks at a time in cramped quarters, surrounded by machinery, pipes, and the ever-present hum of reactors. Air was recycled, food was rationed, privacy was non-existent. Yet these men carried the weight of the world's deadliest weapons, missiles with warheads capable of leveling entire cities. The commander of K-219 was Captain Igor Britanov, a seasoned officer who understood both the responsibility and the risk of his assignment. His orders were to patrol within striking range of the eastern seaboard of the United States, ensuring that if nuclear war broke out, the USSR could retaliate with devastating force. It was the logic of mutually assured destruction: keep the enemy in check by always reminding him that annihilation is only minutes away. The waters where K-219 sailed were not empty. American submarines also stalked the Atlantic, shadowing their Soviet counterparts, listening for the faint noises that betrayed their presence. Every dive, every patrol was a dangerous game of cat and mouse. Sailors joked grimly that somewhere in the dark, an American submarine was always listening. And often, they were right. But for the crew of K-219, October 1986 began like many other patrols. The submarine slid beneath the waves, leaving behind the cold ports of the Soviet North, its sailors resigned to weeks of monotony broken only by drills, maintenance, and the constant pressure to remain undetected. The air was stale, the metal walls sweated with condensation, and the men moved through narrow corridors with the discipline of soldiers who knew that mistakes could be fatal. Despite the routine, there was tension. Everyone aboard understood the dangers of their ship. Yankee-class submarines had a reputation for technical problems. Their missile tubes were powerful but temperamental, their reactors efficient but volatile. On K-219, several crew members whispered about earlier leaks and malfunctions that had been patched up but never fully solved. As one sailor would later remark, "We were sailing a time bomb. And yet, duty was duty." The Soviet Navy demanded constant patrols, and K-219 was one of many boats tasked with keeping the Americans in check. The sailors played cards in their off hours, wrote letters they could not send, and tried to ignore the claustrophobia that gnawed at them. For most, it was just another patrol. For Captain Britanov, it was another mission to complete, another test of his crew's endurance. What none of them could know was that this patrol would not end like the others. The Atlantic was about to remind them that even the most powerful weapons of man are fragile before the forces of fire, water, and fate. Because aboard K-219, deep within its steel hull, one missile tube carried a fatal weakness. And in a matter of days, that weakness would ignite into one of the most terrifying disasters of the Cold War. Chapter 2: Disaster Strikes. The morning of October 3, 1986, began like any other aboard K-219. The submarine glided silently through the deep Atlantic, its crew following their rigid routines. Sailors checked gauges, monitored reactor levels, polished instruments, and endured the monotony of patrol life. But beneath that routine, danger had been growing for days, hidden inside one of the submarine's 16 missile tubes. The weapon in question was a R-27 nuclear missile, housed in a vertical silo that ran through the pressure hull. The missile itself carried a warhead designed to destroy an American city. But like all Soviet submarine missiles of its era, it was stored, wet, surrounded by seawater inside its launch tube, sealed by a hatch at the top. That hatch had developed a leak. For a time, the crew had managed to control it, pumping water out and patching where they could. But the pressure of the ocean is relentless. Seawater continued to seep into the silo, corroding seals, mixing with missile fuel vapors. It was a deadly cocktail waiting for a spark. Shortly after dawn, the disaster struck. A sharp hissing sound echoed through the missile compartment, followed by a deafening explosion. The leaking missile tube had ruptured. Flames burst upward, shattering the hatch and shooting a geyser of fire and black smoke through the submarine. The shockwave ripped through the hull, killing 2 sailors instantly and injuring several others. Panic swept through the missile compartment as men fought to contain the inferno. The fire suppression systems failed to stop the blaze, and smoke poured into adjoining compartments. In the control room, alarms screamed. Captain Britanov, jolted by the explosion, immediately ordered emergency procedures. He knew what was at stake. Just meters away from the fire sat nuclear warheads and the twin nuclear reactors that powered the submarine. If the flames spread, the result could be unthinkable: a nuclear detonation or a reactor meltdown deep in the Atlantic. The crew scrambled to seal off the missile compartment, but the damage was already catastrophic. Seawater flooded through ruptured seams, filling the silo with a poisonous mix of water, missile fuel, and burning debris. The submarine listed as compartments began to flood. Men coughed and choked as smoke spread through the corridors. Communication between compartments broke down as sailors struggled against heat, darkness, and chaos. In the midst of the disaster, the crew showed remarkable discipline. Sailors worked in suffocating smoke, passing buckets of water, dragging wounded comrades, and fighting the fire with whatever they had. But the explosion had already dealt a fatal blow. The missile tube could not be salvaged. The submarine's fate now hung on whether the fire would ignite further warheads or reach the reactors. On the surface above, American satellites and submarines detected the disturbance. The explosion and sudden change in K2-19's behavior did not go unnoticed. In Washington, analysts would later pore over reports, wondering if the Soviets had suffered an accident, or if something more sinister had occurred. For the crew trapped below, the reality was simple: survival. As the flames raged and compartments filled with smoke, Captain Britanov made a desperate choice. He ordered the submarine to surface. It was a risky move. Surfacing in the middle of the Atlantic exposed K219 to detection by American forces. But remaining submerged meant certain death. When K219 broke through the waves, smoke billowed from its sail, a black plume rising into the sky. For the men aboard, the nightmare was only beginning. The fire was not yet contained, the flooding was worsening, and the submarine, armed with nuclear missiles, was crippled in one of the most sensitive stretches of ocean on Earth. The Cold War had suddenly become more dangerous. And for the crew of K219, the battle to save their submarine, and their lives, had only just begun. Chapter 3: A fight for survival. When K219 surfaced in the middle of the Atlantic, it was a scene of chaos and desperation. Thick black smoke poured from the submarine's missile hatches, rising in an ominous column that betrayed its position to anyone watching the horizon. Inside, conditions were nightmarish. The explosion had ripped through bulkheads, killed crewmen in an instant, and filled compartments with smoke so dense that sailors crawled on the floor just to breathe. Captain Igor Britanov faced an impossible task: saving both his crew and a vessel loaded with 34 nuclear warheads and 2 reactors. If the fire reached them, the result would not just be the loss of the submarine, it could trigger a nuclear catastrophe that poisoned the Atlantic and potentially escalated into a global crisis. The crew divided into teams, each fighting a different battle. Some struggled to keep the flooding at bay, sealing off compartments and pumping out seawater that gushed through ruptures. Others fought the fire, hauling extinguishers and fire hoses into choking smoke. Still others tended to the wounded, men burned by flames, half blinded by smoke, or injured by the explosion. The most desperate struggle was in the reactor compartment. The fire had spread dangerously close to the reactors that powered K219. If the coolant pumps failed, the reactors could overheat, leading to a meltdown. In the narrow, sweltering space, sailors worked frantically to keep the system stable. Among them was a 20-year-old sailor named Sergei Preminin. Preminin was young, quiet, and dutiful, the kind of sailor who never drew much attention. But when the crisis struck, he became the man on whom the fate of the submarine, and perhaps the world, rested. As the fire raged, one of the reactors began to lose control. The automatic systems failed, leaving only manual intervention. Someone would have to enter the reactor compartment, in suffocating heat and rising radiation, to manually lower the control rods and shut it down. It was essentially a death sentence. Preminin volunteered. Together with a fellow sailor, he forced his way into the compartment. The air was searing, heavy with toxic smoke. The men struggled with the mechanisms, their hands burning as they tried to lower the rods. One by one, they managed to bring the reactor under control. But then, disaster struck again. The door to the compartment warped in the heat and pressure. It jammed. Preminin's companion managed to escape, but Sergei was trapped. His fellow sailors heard him shout, banging desperately on the hatch. They tried to pull it open, but it would not budge. The young sailor, who had just saved the submarine from nuclear meltdown, died alone in the darkness. His body was never recovered. Preminin's sacrifice bought the crew precious time. The reactor was stabilized, preventing a chain reaction that might have doomed them all. But the submarine was still crippled. Flooding continued. The missile compartment was ruined. And every hour that passed brought the risk of new explosions or reactor failure. On the surface, Soviet rescue vessels were racing toward K219's position. But so were American submarines. The USS Augusta, an American attack sub, had been shadowing Soviet patrols in the Atlantic. Some aboard K219 even suspected that a collision with Augusta had caused the missile tube to rupture in the first place, a claim the US Navy has always denied. Whatever the truth, the Americans were now uncomfortably close, watching as their adversary struggled with a nuclear nightmare just miles from their own coastline. Inside K219, morale hung by a thread. The sailors were exhausted, smoke-blackened, and terrified. But under Britannia's command, they held together. They had contained the fire, stabilized the reactor, and kept the crippled submarine afloat. For now. But the question remained, could they save K219 itself? Or was the submarine already doomed to join the long list of Soviet vessels lost to the deep? Chapter 4: The sinking of K219. For several days after the explosion, K219 floated on the surface of the Atlantic like a wounded beast. Its steel hull was scarred and blackened, smoke still drifting from its missile hatches. The crew, exhausted and traumatized, clung to hope that the submarine could be saved. But deep down, many knew the truth: their vessel was dying. Captain Igor Britanov faced relentless pressure from Moscow. Orders came crackling over the radio: save the submarine at all costs. The Kremlin did not want to admit that one of its nuclear-armed submarines was crippled within reach of American forces. Worse, it did not want the United States to capture the wreck, or the 34 nuclear warheads still on board. On deck, sailors struggled in rough seas, trying desperately to keep K-219 stable. Pumps ran constantly, but the flooding was winning. Every hour, seawater crept further into the submarine's compartments, mixing with fuel residue and radioactive contamination. The ship listed dangerously, its bow dipping lower into the waves. The Soviet Navy dispatched rescue ships to the scene, among them the freighter Krasnogvardisk. When they arrived, they found a grim sight. Sailors huddled on the deck of a submarine that looked like a ghost ship, its hull cracked and scarred, smoke still seeping from within. Evacuation began. Sailors clambered aboard lifeboats or jumped into the icy Atlantic, hauled to safety by the rescue ships. Many were too weak to move on their own, their lungs scarred by smoke and their bodies battered by exhaustion. For them, survival was victory enough. But Captain Britanov refused to abandon ship so quickly. He argued with his superiors, demanding to stay aboard until every sailor was accounted for. He also insisted that K-219 was beyond saving, that forcing his crew to remain aboard was pointless and dangerous. His defiance would later cost him dearly, but in the moment, it saved lives. On October 6, with most of the crew evacuated, K-219 fought its last battle. The flooding had reached critical levels. Pumps failed. The bow dipped lower. The submarine shuddered as compartments collapsed under the pressure. Slowly, almost reluctantly, K-219 began to sink. The men who watched from the rescue ship saw a haunting sight, the massive steel giant sliding beneath the waves, pulled into the abyss. Within minutes, the Atlantic swallowed it whole. K-219 disappeared into the darkness, carrying with it 2 nuclear reactors and 16 nuclear missiles. It came to rest on the seafloor, nearly 6,000 meters down, too deep for recovery, but close enough to American waters to spark years of speculation. Some claimed that the accident was not an accident at all. Rumors spread of a collision with the American submarine USS Augusta, which had been shadowing Soviet patrols. Officially, the US Navy denied any involvement. But many Soviet sailors, including survivors of K-219, swore they felt an impact before the missile tube ruptured. The truth remains a mystery, locked away in classified reports and the silence of the deep. As K-219 sank, the Soviets faced not only a military disaster, but a public relations nightmare. Just 5 months earlier, the world had watched Chernobyl unfold. Now, another Soviet nuclear catastrophe had struck, this time at sea, involving weapons that could have destroyed cities. Moscow tried to control the narrative, downplaying the scale of the accident, even as Western media speculated about radioactive contamination in the Atlantic. For the sailors who survived, the sight of their submarine vanishing into the ocean was heartbreaking. They had lived, but their comrades, including Sergei Preminin, were gone forever. Their home, their mission, their pride, all now rested in the cold, crushing dark of the Atlantic floor. Chapter 5: Legacy of a Tragedy. When the last ripple faded from the Atlantic and K-219 disappeared into the deep, the disaster was far from over. The submarine was gone, but its legacy would haunt both the Soviet Navy and the Cold War itself for years to come. For Moscow, the loss of K-219 was a humiliation. Just months earlier, the world had been shaken by Chernobyl, a catastrophe that revealed the weaknesses of Soviet nuclear technology. Now, another nuclear disaster had struck, this time in the military domain. Once again, secrecy was the first response. Soviet officials downplayed the incident, releasing only vague statements. They insisted there was no radiation leak, no danger to the public, no confrontation with American forces. But sailors who survived knew the truth. The submarine had been a floating coffin long before it sank, and it had taken a miracle and sacrifice to prevent global catastrophe. The most enduring symbol of that sacrifice was Sergei Preminin. The young sailor who gave his life to manually shut down K-219's reactor became a hero in Russia. For years, his story was little known outside military circles, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, his courage was finally recognized. Preminin's hometown erected a monument in his honor, and today he is remembered as one of the unsung heroes of the Cold War, a man who prevented the Atlantic from becoming another Chernobyl. The geopolitical fallout was more complicated. In the West, analysts debated the cause of the accident. Some were convinced that K-219 had collided with the USS Augusta, one of the American submarines tracking Soviet patrols. The US Navy denied this, but suspicions lingered, fueled by survivor testimony. If true, it would mean the Cold War had nearly sparked a nuclear incident through an underwater clash that neither side dared to admit. To this day, the question remains unanswered: accident, negligence, or covert confrontation? For Captain Igor Britanov, the disaster became personal. Instead of being honored for saving his crew, he was blamed. Soviet authorities accused him of negligence, court-martialed him, and tried to make him the scapegoat for the tragedy. Only after the collapse of the USSR was he partially rehabilitated, his reputation restored. Britanov maintained until his death that he had done everything possible to protect his men, and history seems to agree. Environmentally, the sinking of K-219 was another ticking time bomb. The submarine rests nearly 6,000 meters below the surface, with its 2 reactors and 16 nuclear missiles still aboard. Officially, the Soviet Navy sealed the missile hatches before the boat went down. Unofficially, no one knows for certain what condition they are in today. Some scientists warn that the wreck could still pose a contamination risk if its metal casing corrodes. For now, the deep Atlantic keeps its secrets. The story of K-219 is one of contrasts, of human courage and systemic failure, of secrecy and truth, of tragedy narrowly avoiding catastrophe. It reminds us how fragile the balance of the Cold War truly was. A single explosion in a missile silo, hundreds of miles from land, could have set off a chain reaction leading to nuclear escalation between the superpowers. In the end, the submarine's legacy is both cautionary and heroic. It warns us of the dangers of pushing technology and men to the breaking point in pursuit of military dominance. And it honors the sailors who fought, suffered, and in some cases died to prevent disaster. K-219 was more than a submarine. It was a symbol of the perilous game played beneath the oceans during the Cold War, a game where the stakes were nothing less than the survival of humanity. This was the story of K-219, the Soviet nuclear submarine disaster, a tragedy that could have sparked nuclear war, but instead became a tale of sacrifice and survival. If you found this deep dive into Cold War history fascinating, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more untold stories from the hidden battlefields of history.